Pay up or come up with a payment plan by the end of the year. The US Secretary of State issues a warning to NATO allies to increase their defense spending. But what happens if they don't? What does it say about the US commitment to Europe? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson is reassuring European allies in NATO. The US has still got their backs, but at a price. At a NATO meeting in Brussels on Friday, Tillerson pressured member states to increase their defense spending. He says he wants to see countries increase spending by the end of the year. Germany's pushing back, saying that is not reachable. Well, the US official says he wants NATO leaders to agree on spending policy at a meeting at the end of next month. We'll talk to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Niamh Barker in Brussels.
Military snipers man the roof of NATO headquarters. They're not normally here. It's because of special American visitors in town. Enter Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, the latest in a string of top Trump administration politicians to meet with America's NATO alliance partners.
Morning, all.
He's here to press NATO countries to spend more on their militaries and do more to tackle the alliance's biggest challenges.
I think we have three important areas we want to talk about. First is ensuring that NATO has all of the resources, financial and otherwise, that are necessary for NATO to fulfill its mission. Secondly, we want to discuss how we can build on NATO's already important involvement in the fight to defeat ISIS. And then lastly, we want to obviously have a discussion around NATO's posture here in Europe, most particularly Eastern Europe, in response to Russia's aggression in Ukraine.
Southern Russia earlier this month. Dozens of Russian tanks are filmed arriving on the Ukrainian border, part of what's been called the largest buildup of troops in the region since the Cold War. On Wednesday, hundreds of pieces of heavy US equipment rolled into Poland. 4,000 NATO troops are currently fanning out across Eastern Europe to send a clear message to Moscow that the alliance is a force to be reckoned with. But it all comes at a cost. The US wants each of its NATO alliance partners to spend 2% of economic output, or GDP, on military defence, something that the NATO alliance had already promised to try and achieve by 2024. So far, only 5 countries, the US, UK, Estonia, Poland and Greece, are meeting these obligations. But the concern is that if the deadline is in any way brought forward, nations like Spain, Italy and Portugal with large fiscal deficits may struggle to pay.
Many nations owe vast sums of money.
But President Trump is resolute. When the German Chancellor Angela Merkel travelled to Washington to meet him, he took to Twitter soon afterwards to accuse Germany of owing vast sums of money to the US and NATO. Germany was quick to remind the US that NATO countries don't pay America to defend them and that the spending targets are meant as a general guideline. But Washington's $800 billion military budget, more than the other 27 NATO members combined, is essential for the alliance's future. The US says it remains committed to NATO, but unless its allies pay more, Washington may start paying less. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, Brussels.
Well, let's have a listen in to what the German foreign minister had to say about Tillerson's demands.
2% would mean that Germany puts 70 billion euros into the military. I don't know any politician in Germany who would claim that it is reachable or desirable.
Well, the US Secretary of State has only repeated previous calls from the White House that the 28 members of NATO should increase their defense spending. The US President Donald Trump stated his doubts about NATO earlier this year, calling the alliance obsolete. And at a security meeting in Munich in February, the Vice President, Mike Pence, said Europe must increase its military spending in a dangerous world. Defense Secretary Jim Mattis has threatened NATO with reduced US support, saying the US will no longer carry a disproportionate share of defense of Western values. Let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Berlin, Dietrich Von Kyaw, a former German ambassador and the permanent representative to the EU. In Washington, Lawrence Korb, a former US Assistant Secretary of Defense. And also in Berlin, Marko Mihkelson, head of the Estonian delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Marko, you actually have come to the show from a NATO meeting that's discussing budget issues. Tell us how those US warnings on Friday are going down. Are NATO members now scrambling to try and boost their defense spending?
Look, yes, the NATO Parliamentary Assembly actually for already several years have had discussions about defense expenditures. And to my knowledge at the moment, or what I see in discussion with my colleagues from all NATO member states, message is there. Actually, everybody understands that those challenges we commonly have for alliance need to be addressed also through serious rise of expenditures. Yes, there are different countries who have different levels at the moment, but for sure there is no real kind of opposition to the idea that we have to seriously put more money into defense.
All right, so everybody understands the message, Dietrich. Can NATO members, though, meet that 2% target, or at least have a really concrete plan to do so by the end of the year?
Well, they have committed themselves, all of them, including Germany, to meet the target or to work as much as possible towards this line, the 2% GDP line and target, and to come as close as possible, and if possible even meet the target in 10 years after the decision was taken in 2014. That means in 2024 we should be there. My country last
okay,
year
but now the US is pushing the
increased.
timeline a little differently. It says it wants the NATO leaders to be ready to agree on everything by May, in terms of either having met that target by the end of this year, 2017, or have a really good plan to show how it's going to get there.
Well, I don't know. We have elections, and the reaction of my foreign minister yesterday clearly indicates that this is not an easy stuff for us, and there's always temptation to play a special role to a certain extent without putting into question the commitment. So I don't know. We have the election in September, how we will be able to commit ourselves already towards the end of this year. I'm afraid that might become difficult, but it could probably be also somewhat postponed. We accept the pressure, we see it, and we also accept our commitment, and at least in principle, and we are working towards it. We have increased last year, we will continue to increase regularly. So in principle, there's no worry, but nobody can commit himself or herself at this moment to meet absolutely the whole target with certitude in 2024. But we will work hard. The German problem is also that we have enormous additional expenditure in view of the refugee crisis and the need to strengthen the external borders of the European Union in view of
Okay, let me jump in here, Dietrich. Forgive me. We'll come back to the reasons why Germany feels is not so sure it can meet the new US timeline. Okay. But let me ask the question to Lawrence. So what happens if officials aren't ready in May, Lawrence, to commit to the US timeline?
Nothing really is going to happen. This 2% of GDP is much more psychological or political than, a security driven. It's not so how much you spend, but what you spend it on. We almost have the same debate in the United States, where President Obama was criticized for, while he was president, the GDP percentage we spent on defense dropping from 4 to 3%. And really
but
what
Lawrence,
happened was the economy got
you
better.
Get when you listen to what Rex Tillerson has to say and what the US President Trump has been saying, is it?
No, it isn't. But I think what he wants to do, and he's not the first one, Bob Gates, when he was Secretary of Defense, Leon Panetta, Chuck Hagel, all said the same thing. And basically what they're trying to show to the American people is we're not bearing, an unequal part of the burden. But you go back, back in the 80s, we said 3% of GDP. Nobody got there. We won the Cold War. After the Cold War ended, we expanded NATO. And as our colleague from Germany said, it's not just what you spend, it's what you're spending it on. And the other thing that, this administration shows, they don't seem to understand what NATO does and how it works. You don't contribute money to some sort of general fund. Each country, has its own forces, and then you conduct joint exercises and work together. But I think Trump campaigned on this platform of I'm going to make our allies, pay more so we can pay less. Well, if he's trying to get them to pay more, he just wanted to increase our defense budget by $84 billion in fiscal 17 and 18. So what kind of signal is that sending?
A lot of signals that need to be deciphered here. Let me come back to Dietrich. I cut you off, and let me ask you the question then. If Estonia, for example, can meet the 2% target, why does Germany feel, according to the foreign minister, that it's really unrealistic?
I told you already that we are in a beginning election campaign. Nobody knows whether this exactly and 100% whether this is unrealistic. We have committed ourselves to work in this direction, and we have committed ourselves in view of threats and challenges coming not only from Russia, in view of policies in Ukraine and in Syria, but also because of ISIS and the threat of international terrorism.
So are you saying it's bad timing, Dietrich, because of the elections? It would be domestically unpopular for any politician to talk about increasing defense spending, which is...
It is, in a certain sector of the German public, it is unpopular. In a certain sector. But generally speaking, public opinion accepts that we have to do more in order to have adequate burden sharing. The difficulty is always the exact figures, but because nobody knows where we'll be in 3 years.
Right, go ahead, Marco.
Yeah, in Estonia, we actually decided to go up to the level of 2% already in 2011. So far before the Ukraine crisis started, and what we see actually from next year on, actually, the Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland all meet 2% level. Lithuania pledged already by 2020 to raise up to the 2.5%, and we all should understand where are the existential threats to alliance, to all of us, to our space of interest, Euro-Atlantic community. And to be sure, Russia is the only one who poses existential threat to alliance at this particular moment. And this is why we all commonly should really think what kind of capabilities we need to deter these threats today. And NATO has done a great deal of job to implement Warsaw Summit agreements deploying the EFPs in the Baltic states and Poland. But we all should understand that Article 3 in Washington Treaty is something also we have to keep in mind at national level.
Marco, you mentioned a bunch of countries there. Of course, they all have in common, as you pointed out, that they are much closer to Russia's border. Do countries closer to Russia's border, the members of NATO that is, feel comforted by, I guess, what you could call the more hawkish tone that's coming out of US officials now, such as Tillerson and Mattis, when it comes to Russia?
Look, as was mentioned earlier, that this is not something the kind of very new topic when we all talk from US administration, there is a pointing to the defense spendings. This has been for years, and I have been in NATO Parliamentary Assembly for now 6 years, and this topic has been always up. Today, what I said earlier, the people, the politicians across NATO member countries understand much better that we have to put more attention to national defense spendings.
Right, but there is a nuanced change. Forgive me, Marco, but you wouldn't disagree. There is a nuanced change in the sort of message we were hearing out of US officials, particularly President Trump, or during his campaign days towards Russia, and the sort of message we're hearing now from the likes of Tillerson and Mattis, right?
Right, yeah, well, but again, I agree with Lawrence that there is a more sociological, mental issues here in terms of how to see what 2% or defense spendings mean actually for each of member states. And I just bring an example, how do we in Estonia spend today 2.2% of GDP, what we allocated for defense, 30% goes for personnel, 30% to keeping up what we have, and 40% for investments. And this is something what is very much also we have to focus on, not only to talk about certain benchmark.
All right, perhaps this is a good time to remind ourselves of some of those recent signals which indicate relations between the US and Russia may be heading for tension, and how it wasn't always that way. As you might remember, as a presidential candidate, Donald Trump frequently promised to seek friendlier ties with Moscow. He repeatedly avoided criticizing President Putin and called him very smart in one tweet. But now there's kind of a tougher stance from the Trump administration. US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson criticized Russia at his first NATO meeting on Friday. He wants talks, he said, with allies about what he called Russia's aggression in Ukraine. And US Defense Secretary James Mattis says Russia is choosing to be a strategic competitor and accused it of what he called mucking around in other people's elections. Lawrence, when you put all of this together, what does it say about the US administration, how it views NATO and how it views European security interests right now?
Well, you've got two groups in the administration. You have the president, who appeals to his popular base, and then you've got what I would call the grown-ups, like Secretary Mattis, who's a retired general, Mr. Tillerson, who is executive of a big company, and they did the same thing. They're doing the same thing in Europe that they did in Asia. When they went over to Asia, they told the South Koreans and the Japanese, no, don't get nuclear weapons, and we'll be there to defend you if North Korea or China should push too far. And I think what they're going over there and saying, well, yeah, you ought to do more, but the alliance is still, viable. And listening to my colleagues, I was thinking, let's say we had a big economic boom in Europe. And even though they increased their defense spending, they wouldn't meet 2% of GDP. And that's where I think, again, it's more psychological.
Okay, but hang on, Lawrence. It sounds like what you're saying is that the Trump administration's policy to Russia hasn't really evolved or changed. It's that we're getting different signals from different people. One sort of message from Trump, one sort of message from Tillerson and Mattis. Is that what you're saying?
Well, basically, yeah, and you see it in a lot of areas. And I think, basically, particularly General Mattis, or Secretary Mattis, I mean, he used to be a NATO commander. He knows what's going on over there. He knows what the Russians are up to. He knows the capabilities. And so what we're basically saying, and he works with Secretary Tillerson, is, look, we have to send the right signal to Russia. And the signal to Russia is we're going to increase defense spending, particularly since, what you've done. And don't forget, the Europeans have the sanctions on Russia, which hurt them much more than the United States. So I think it's important to look at all of these things together. And again, I have no doubt that when all is said and done, a year from now, NATO will be going on just as it is now, and we're not going to pull out or, anything like that. And if there is some sort of, increase in defense spending by some of the countries, Trump can declare victory. See, I got him to spend more. As well, my colleague said, this goes back to 2011. We were talking about this, so this is not new. Trump will take credit for it.
All right, is that the way it's being seen in Europe, though, Dietrich? Who, from the European perspective, really speaks for a US policy towards NATO? Surely it's Trump, isn't it?
Well, I think we should not take Trump too much by his words, but by the action taken in due course by the US administration as a whole. And I am also not that pessimistic in spite of the fact that there is a lot of uncertainty that has been created by the often careless way in which arguments were floated on the other side of the Atlantic. For instance, we are presently threatened trade-wise by this America First policy of protectionism in a very serious way. At the same time, we are told in a very direct way that we should finally increase even further our defense spending. Now, as I said, we are willing, in spite of all these uncertainties, to live up to our commitments in the alliance. Not because we like all the utterings that come from the White House, but because we feel threatened from ISIS, from migration, and from aggressive Russia. And we have to make a larger share, also we Germans, due to our economic strength. We accept this, but we need a certain time to shift policies. Last year we increased, and this year we increased by 1 billion our expenditure. We are going strongly in the right direction. We cannot guarantee that we will meet the target at any cost in 2024. We cannot guarantee that a schedule which we might accept will be totally followed throughout all these years, because we may have a different government. But in any case, we are going to move together in solidarity towards the goal, because we need to increase our defenses.
Okay,
unfortunately,
let me bring Marco in, if I may.
The end of history
so
is
as Dietrich pointed out, there are a bit of different signals sometimes, not only when it comes to defense, but if you compare defense and trade policy. I guess the bottom line is, does anyone in Europe feel that the US commitment to European security, to NATO, is weakening, if not, to use Jim Mattis' word on the 15th of February 2017, moderating? Perhaps it might be willing to moderate its commitment, as he put it.
You know, from Estonian perspective, and the meetings what I had with senators, congressmen, also our officials, with Mattis, Tillerson, our foreign minister, just met a few days ago, and also Vice President Pence, they all deliver a very similar message, that the US commitment is strong to its allies, to NATO. And also what we see on ground, actually, the EFP is going on. US is sending its troops to Poland and the Baltic states, and this is something what actually confirms that the current US administration is strongly committed to
so that all of that overshadows the tweets which have come out from the US president for you. Is that correct, Marco?
Let me say something here if I can.
Okay, let's give Marco a brief chance to respond to that. We'll come to you, Lawrence.
Yeah, I don't have any doubts that actually, that partly it's interesting that Trump's campaign contributed to the alliance one very strong message. Russia is meddling into our internal affairs and trying to influence our decision-making.
Okay, we've got about a minute left. Let me give it to Lawrence. Go ahead.
Well, basically, in our defense budget this year, and the one that Trump is supporting, has what we call the European Reassurance Initiative. We're sending troops to Eastern Europe in addition to the ones we had in Germany. So we're doing what needs to be done, and we're working exercises with all of the countries in that region. We're putting in a missile defense system into Poland and Romania, which Trump is not stopping.
And none of that will change, Lawrence.
So we are increasing our support. No, it won't change, because they've already got the budget, and the budget is the key thing. Trump has not taken it out of the budget. And so, if anything, he's going to increase the number of people in the Army by 60,000. Where do you think they're going to go? They're not going to go to the Middle East. We just have, mainly special forces there.
Right. All right. We are going to have to leave this discussion, as interesting as it is. We'll have to leave it there for now and thank our guests, Dietrich Von Kyaw, Lawrence Korb, and Marco Michelson. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here, for now, it's goodbye.